First, getting into the Mercedes 190, you notice the seat position is relatively low, and also the steering wheel is absolutely huge. I think the steering wheel diameter is something like 39 centimeters, and even on the original versions they were over 41 centimeters wide. One thing you do notice before setting off is the low window position. The low window line gives you excellent vision. Both the A, B and even the C pillars are relatively slim by today's standards. As you turn the vehicle on to the first throttle position, you'll hear the fuel pump initialise, the Bosch Cagetronic. One turn and the car fires up and into drive. One striking feature as you start to get out on the road and put a few miles under your belt is the 15-inch wheels really give huge benefits in terms of ride quality. By today's standard, this level of ride quality on this size of car is really amazing. Even with these slightly wider tyres on this particular car, the steering is giving a significant amount of feel, although the steering is probably somewhat heavier than other power steering setups. One benefit of the vehicle's size is that it's really easy to navigate this vehicle and thread the vehicle through traffic or through narrow country lanes. And significantly, if you consider the vehicle only has 122 brake horsepower, it's relatively sprightly, certainly in a more sportier setting for the automatic gearbox. One of the benefits of this has got to be weight. This vehicle weighs just shy of 1100 kilos, and if you look at a modern Mercedes C-Class, that vehicle will be around 15 to 1600 kilos in base trim. So although it has more power, it actually has more weight as well. The brakes are a disc setup all round, and they really stop the car very well. There's certainly no reason not to have any confidence in the brakes of this car. As I mentioned earlier, the all-round vision and the low window line really gives you huge benefits when you come into junctions or areas where you need to observe other traffic to pull out. One thing that is also striking with the car is that when this vehicle went on sale, it was competing with the E30 BMW, which ran from 1982, when this vehicle was launched, or just before, to the early 90s. So you need to remember that by 1990, the date of manufacture of this vehicle, it had already been in production for 7 to 8 years, and certainly on sale in the UK for 7 years. So it was relatively towards the end of its life, and within 3 years it will be replaced by the W202 model. Now if we compare this with the E30 of the same period, certainly there is more space in the vehicle, but in terms of handling, I would say that the E36 BMW that was launched towards the back end of this vehicle's life is a much sharper steer. Certainly feels more modern inside, the steering wheel's smaller, and having had experience of driving a 316i from 1992 in the past, I can confirm that it's probably a sharper steer. Although in terms of the absolute handling, this vehicle hangs on really well. It's got a multi-link rear suspension, and not only do you get benefits in terms of ride, but actually whilst the steering is a really large steering wheel, which probably robs you of some agility and some feel, actually the car does go around bends pretty well. At the time this vehicle was launched, there was the 1.8 carburetor with 105 horsepower, this derivative with 122, and then above this you've got a 6-cylinder 2.6 engine and a 4-cylinder so-called Cosworth derivatives 2.3, or in the later versions 2.5. This vehicle doesn't feel particularly outclassed, certainly against the carburetor model with 105 brake horsepower, but to be honest, I'm told the gap between the 1.8 injected vehicle, which actually replaced the carburetor model later in the later years, actually the gap between the 1.8 and the two injector models is relatively small. Although this vehicle doesn't benefit from air conditioning, as I mentioned in a previous video, it does have a dual zone form of control to the airflow, and in actual fact the vehicle's got all-round tinted glass with a quite predominant shade band above the front windscreen. So acceleration, whilst it's not particularly brisk and the pedal is pretty hard to push down, to be honest with you, it does pick up quite well. And simply because of the ride quality, you can take relatively rough roads at a reasonable pace. You certainly don't need to back off because of ride quality. The seats themselves probably were considered extremely hard, as indeed all German seats were at the beginning, but 31 years later the seats have given a little bit, and after something like 71,500 miles they're obviously a more comfortable place to be. Although they do fit quite low down into your back, and the seating position, as I mentioned before, is quite low. You can adjust the cushion up at the front and you can adjust the height as well. One thing you do notice with this vehicle, it gets an awful lot of attention, certainly against more modern vehicles on the road. And when you think that this vehicle was relatively common in its day, at peak I think there were something like over 30 to 40,000 vehicles by the end of UK sales. Now there are around about 2,700 of the 190s licensed on the UK roads. So they're becoming rarer year by year, but they are survivors. If we consider the volume manufacturers of the period, certainly the vehicles you could buy for this price level, the list price of this vehicle, £17,200, would have actually bought you a very high spec Vauxhall Cavalier GSI with something like 150 horsepower. It would have bought you a mid or low spec vehicle from the class above, which would have been in this case a Granada, a Vauxhall Carlton, and its contemporary BMW 3 Series would have been a little bit cheaper. So this certainly wasn't a cheap car by any standard, particularly when you consider the additional cost of equipment in those days. £2,000 for factory fitted aircon, something like almost £600 for ABS brakes. It's quite possible that you could spec this up, as indeed this car was spec'd to quite a high level. It wouldn't take much to get the vehicle certainly over £19,000 to £20,000. One thing that's worth commenting on is the noise levels. I've been quite surprised with this car, how quiet it is by today's standard. You would expect that larger, more modern cars with lighter materials but better sound insulation would actually outclass this car, but in actual fact that's not been the case. It's a relatively comfortable place to sit, and on the motorway at 70 miles an hour plus, it's actually quite a relaxing place to be. It's quite effortless. probably would benefit by the fitment of the optional cruise control, which may be something that you could probably retrofit to older models with the right wiring. Whilst I've mentioned steering before, steering feel is pretty good, and also steering lock. When you come to park this vehicle, you really find the benefits of a pretty good steering lock, but actually you find huge benefits in terms of the vehicle's relatively narrow size. And in fact, just to put this in context, it's a narrower car than the Generation 2 Toyota Yaris that I tested on an earlier video, so please go back and check that out. The controls themselves, you've got the single control with the wipers, the indicators and the lights, which takes a little bit of getting used to. And the other thing worth mentioning, when you first get into the car, and more noticeable on right-hand drive vehicles and left-hand drive vehicles, is the ignition switch itself, or the basically where you put the key in next to the steering column. That's actually on the left-hand side, which is a bit counterintuitive. Probably in left-hand drive cars it's not such an issue, but in right-hand drive cars, keeping it in the same position is somewhat strange and does take some getting used to. The 4-speed automatic gearbox in this vehicle is relatively smooth, and to be honest, having driven more modern vehicles as well, it's certainly comparable with those. The manual was the standard derivative, 4-speed initially and then moving to a 5-speed later in life. I haven't actually driven the manual, but I don't think it's such a hardship, although I think probably the reputation the Mercedes gearboxes have for manual gearboxes is probably a little bit unfair and not really based on any fact. But overall, the automatic makes it a bit more convenient, certainly when you're in traffic, as most of us find traffic conditions getting heavier and heavier. So can you live with a 1990 Mercedes 190 as a daily driver? Well, actually, you probably could if you bought the right car. So by the late 80s and early 90s, vehicles had started to come fitted with ABS brakes, sometimes as an option, and occasionally, as with the Granada, as standard. Items like power steering were often standard fit on vehicles by this age, certainly power brakes, good heating and ventilation systems, even in-car entertainment, sometimes optional, sometimes standard, was of a reasonable standard. If, for instance, you were talking about buying a car in the 1990s from 30 years earlier, you wouldn't have the same benefits as power brakes and power steering, for example, and you'd have to make certainly a lot of compromises. Also, those cars probably weren't that well built by modern standards. Certainly the issue of rust had been pretty much well dealt with by the late 80s and 90s for many manufacturers, certainly for premium manufacturers in the case of Mercedes. I hope you found this video useful, and if you did, then please like, share and subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you on the next video. Thank you.